Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sam Greene, and I'm going to chair the panel. And you also have the fortune or misfortune of hearing me speak first, along with my co-author, Sobhon Khairy. And then Nathan Toronto will go second. So I'm a faculty member at Shepherd University in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, where I teach political science and global studies. Previously, I was a faculty member at the National Defense College of the United Arab Emirates, where I met Nathan, and a faculty member at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, where I met Sobhon. And this panel, in many ways, is a continuation of these interests. So Nathan is at the Carnegie Center, where he's the commissioning editor of the program on civil military relations in Arab states. So Nathan is an expert on civil military relations, but what I think is really interesting about his book project, which you should all buy if you actually have the budget for that sort of thing, is the link between military reform and innovation, which I think links this to the paper that Sobhon and I are going to present, which looks more at the political economy side. And I'm really excited to have Sobhon on the paper with me. So he was a student at Tufts and an intern at the NISA Center. He's gone on to work in the innovation startup sector. He's currently a research analyst at Pilot 44 Labs in San Francisco, where he's working on emerging technologies, startups, and I think he really is giving our research a great practical side to understanding the innovation sector, which is a really important part of economic diversification strategies for Gulf countries. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. We'll both speak for about 20 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for some excellent questions from the audience, or if not, Nathan can grill me, which he's also very talented at doing. Very good. So Sobhon and I are going to take turns speaking. I'll start by providing some context. Basically, this paper got stalled because of COVID, but I think that actually is going to make the paper better. It started at looking at what are the limits of economic diversification in GCC countries. And then after the COVID pause, it's becoming what does COVID mean for diversification? So we'll start by talking about the context of diversification in the Gulf, and then move to what COVID means, and then end with a UAE case study, highlighting in particular what some recent reforms may mean. Right, so if you're not familiar with the GCC, here we are. I had to work very hard to get a map. My panelists will know this, that calls the Arabian Gulf the Arabian Gulf. Here are the 6 member states. We're going to talk a little bit about the broad context and then more specifically about the UAE, the country I know best in the GCC. So first, the pre-COVID context. So the pre-COVID context is one of dependence on natural resource rents, right? These are statistics from primarily from the IMF, right? And you can see during the oil boom up to 2014, lots and lots of growth, very much fueled by natural resource rents, a period of retraction and attempts to diversify. We'll talk about what that means for the UAE in particular, but still government revenues very much dependent on oil and in some cases gas revenue. So there are a lot of imperatives for diversification. The GCC has a young population and nationals need jobs. Traditionally, nationals are supported by the public sector, but that's really obviously not going to be tenable in any of the GCC states. Many of the GCC states have what is often called in the region a demographic imbalance, relying very heavily on foreign labor, and particularly foreign labor to perform in key sectors. And this has obviously been put under strain during COVID. Of course, anytime you rely on natural resource rents, you're exposed to volatility. And that's certainly been the case in all of the Gulf countries. And then there's a question of what does the clock look like? Can we extract forever? The answer is obviously no. And then there's also a question of how long relying on oil and gas is going to be competitive in a changing energy environment. And like I said, it's a young population throughout the Middle East, but particularly the very young population in Saudi, and also very large youth unemployment, right? And particularly for the larger population countries, this is a big challenge in Saudi Arabia, a big challenge in Oman, finding jobs for young nationals. So roughly half of GCC nationals are under the age of 25. And traditionally, nationals have sought jobs in the public sector. That's obviously not sustainable, particularly not at the salaries that are considered desirable. And it's also clear that there has been, and in many cases remains, a preference for public sector employment among nationals. In part, the public sector work week tends to be shorter and better remunerated than the private sector. And this is certainly something that Nathan and I experienced in Abu Dhabi. So in the Arab Youth Survey in 2017, more than 2/3 of nationals want government jobs, despite the fact that the need to diversify this has been a major push. And we talked about the demographic imbalance, right? Here's a picture from one of those prominent malls in Dubai. And of course, there are not a lot of nationals in national dress. Not to say that Dubai is going to be representative of all of the Gulf, but by some estimates in Qatar and UAE, 9 out of every 10 employed workers is a non-citizen. And that's also something that's not really sustainable, right? We talked about price volatility and resource depletion as well. So basically, there's 3 major approaches to diversification. Funding of new industries and economic sectors, initially with resource rents, with the idea that these sectors are going to become competitive. Developing new sources of revenue from what the government's doing, i.e. taxes, fees, parking tickets, and ideally reducing government spending. And third is establishing and further developing endowments that will fund future expenditures, the sovereign wealth fund model. Obviously, states are pursuing all 3 of these. We're going to focus primarily in this presentation on the first one, which is an essential component of all of the GCC states' strategies for diversification. Right, and key things that we've seen are investment in banking and finance, the idea of creating a regional hub, high-end and cultural tourism. On the right, you can see the Louvre, Abu Dhabi. There's also significant investments in Qatar, serving as a transportation and logistic hub, or I say hubs, and then developing the knowledge economy, which will be a really important part of this paper. So a few years ago, I wrote a study on how to do diversification badly. The case of Nauru, a country that's not very well known, but that in many ways literally ran out of its natural resource, in this case, phosphates, through some spectacularly bad investments, such as this picture of the Broadway flop that was state funded by the Republic of Nauru. In 1993, as they're already really seeing problems. So basically, Nauru had lots of phosphates. These were mined. Almost all the deposits were depleted. This was put into a fund that was supposed to fund development that would help the country transition away from dependence on resources toward other things that were sustainable. Right around its independence in 68, so around 1970, one of the highest GDP per capita in the world. And the lessons from Nauru are, as you can see, it's passenger jet being repossessed. There's a lot of focus on prestige investments, which are very risky, in air, in high-end real estate. At the same time, services and subsidies to populations grew and grew and grew and weren't curtailed. And on top of that, Nauru had poor governance and poor management. Not only there are allegations of corruption, there are allegations of cronyism, and certainly lots of inefficiencies. And so this is sort of a perfect storm that leads Nauru going from near Saudi Arabia in GDP per capita to relying on housing Australian detainees who are trying to reach Australia by boat as the key source of government revenue. Right, so this is sort of a model for how to do things badly. And I think everyone who's familiar with the Gulf will see at least some resonance. When I taught this case study in the Gulf, I got a tremendous amount of attention from the audience. So there's some talk that the oil shock of 2014 would be a catalyst for reform. This is going to be sort of the impetus to reduce expenditures and lead to diversification. So there's a bunch of plans for more revenue, reducing subsidies, as well as investment, but this has all been politically very, very painful. Right, so for example, one promise was a 5% VAT, value-added tax that everyone is going to do. Kuwait's parliament was very unhappy with this. Kuwait is saying maybe in 2021, 22, the same as Qatar. And there's been a tremendous amount of pushback that may make further expansion of some of these reforms more difficult. There have been aggressive adoptions of particularly the fee increase piece, which is, as you might imagine, very unpopular in places where citizens have been accustomed to getting things for free from the government. But the challenge is, of course, that there's also pushback in getting nationals into the private sector based on some of the perceived less prestige. As one HR professional said, I know we need this, but I don't want my daughters to work outside the house. And I'm also not really comfortable with them working for the private sector. So there are some cultural limitations and idea to focus on prestige. There are imperatives to spend socially, right? And some of the currents of the Arab Spring have led to increased spending and subsidy. This is an example from Saudi Arabia, who very quickly in 2018, after talking about reductions to subsidies, announced bonuses for state employees, which also reinforces the push into the public sector. Geopolitics is interesting. I'm not going to talk about this at length, although if people are interested, we can talk more about this in Q&A. Of course, there's a huge rift in the GCC, which has just been resolved with Qatar. There's the recognition of Israel. And we'll get to that a little bit when we talk specifically about the UAE side. But the point of talking about some of the limitations is that the strategy of increasing government revenue isn't going to solve the problem in the long term, which is why the diversification piece is so essential. And there are challenges. How much high-end tourism can the region support, and how much can become self-sustaining? How many banking and finance and transport hubs does one region need? Are there assumptions about the prestige of diversification products that don't actually meet what they will deliver? And is it realistic for the identified sectors to become profitable? And there's also a question about the political and cultural model in terms of a transition to the knowledge economy. So for example, 81% of surveyed academics and researchers in the Gulf wanted to leave, primarily in this survey, which I believe is from 2019, because of a lack of academic freedom. Right, so will Gulf countries be willing to make reforms to best position themselves for the knowledge economy that is an essential part of their diversification plan.
Thank you, Professor Greene, and thank you to everyone who organized this event. It's an honor to be a part of the panel. So supporting local entrepreneurship efforts, it's a cornerstone of economic diversification, and Gulf states still have a lot of work to do to make business conditions friendly for local entrepreneurs. So what can these governments do to support this growth of the private sector innovation as a means of diversification? So this World Bank data illuminates this gap with their ease of doing business data, which ranks 190 countries on various metrics that determine how easy it is to start and operate a business in each country. So for example, you can see that Kuwait could improve some of their trade across border rank, and Qatar could work on protecting minority investors. And you can also see that UAE is significantly ahead of the other states in the Gulf when it comes to these metrics. And this is reflected in their startup ecosystem, which is also one of the strongest in the region. And then although each economy has its strengths and weaknesses, the region as a whole could improve on helping entrepreneurs get credit, resolving insolvency, and trading across borders. And we think that improving these conditions will play a large role in facilitating grassroots innovation and growth, as well as economic diversification. So while many global sectors have been negatively affected by COVID, so food businesses, commercial real estate, transportation, for example, we're also seeing a ton of progress, especially on the digital side. Venture capital funding is still flowing, new startups are popping up, and large corporates are still investing in digital and omni-channel innovation. So some of the spaces that we're seeing monumental growth and development during the pandemic, and most of this context is within North America, I'm based in San Francisco, is digital health, retail and online shopping technology, as well as supply chain and last mile delivery technologies. So let's talk about digital health first. So these technologies include telehealth, remote diagnostics, AI health advisors, and these kinds of startups have attracted a ton of venture capital funding during COVID. And one part of this is that governing bodies are starting to loosen the restrictions around digital health technology. And we've seen almost 10 years of growth within a single year. And we're expecting consumers to continue to adopt this technology even after the pandemic is over. The second category was retail and e-commerce. So obviously COVID has affected people's ability to shop in store. This has catalyzed a lot of innovation among retailers globally, as well as direct-to-consumer brands. Grocery and retail orders have skyrocketed as people are afraid to go in store, and retail giants like Walmart and Amazon are fighting this digital fight to capture market share. And then lastly, supply chain and last mile delivery technology. So essentially how all of these orders, packages, food delivery is getting to its final destination. And now that people are at home and ordering remotely, the expectations have increased. Amazon made two-day delivery a norm very quickly, and now urban areas are experiencing 1 or 2 hour delivery for products. And they're also leveraging autonomous delivery, route optimization software, as well as delivery robots. So a lot of cool innovation is happening despite the pandemic. And while these sectors have obviously really flourished and experienced innovation, others have suffered, and COVID has really presented challenges for these sectors, and Professor Greene will highlight some of these challenges.
Sure. So, and I think the link between the broader environment and the GCC is this obviously provides an opportunity for moving into these sectors that Sobhon identified, or perhaps increasing investment. But I think at the same time, there's also a challenge of budget limitations, right? There's already been austerity in the Gulf, and COVID has, as we'll see when we look specifically at the UAE, squeezed budgets even further. So you can see increased, perhaps, public scrutiny of how money is spent, and also perhaps, we can say, increased public opposition to pieces of reform that tighten everyday Khaliji's budgets. So in the next about 5 minutes, we'll talk through the UAE. It has probably the strongest fundamentals of the regions, as we talked about in the ease of doing business. It's the largest recipient of FDI in absolute terms in many years in the MENA region. And it was probably the first mover in the GCC in terms of diversification. As Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed said, will we be happy when we're no longer oil exporters? With the sort of the subtext, if we don't do it right, we've identified this problem. There's a big push to diversify. You'll hear a lot of how much of the economic activity in the UAE comes from non-oil sectors. That is true, but it's also important to understand that of the 2/3 of non-oil exports, a lot in 2018, 47% of these are re-exports, which isn't quite the same as 2/3 non-oil exports of goods and services truly originating in the UAE. Right, so transport and logistics, education, innovation, technology, tourism, and construction and real estate are sort of key sectors in the UAE's economic diversification strategy, are really fitting in with what a lot of Gulf countries are trying to do. If you travel to the region, you've probably flown on Etihad. If you watch soccer or football, however you want to call it, you've probably seen Etihad advertisements. If you like Formula One, right? So Etihad is sort of a classic prestige investment. And the idea is we're going to create a world-class airline. It's going to be good for the country's brand, yes, but it's also going to be this profitable piece of the transportation. It's going to be a profitable piece that will link together luxury tourism, etc. This picture is from 2017 or 2018. Etihad to be profitable by 2023. And so Etihad ran very modest profits from 2011 to 2015 after a number of years of losses that were not disclosed. But as the sort of oil price drop leads to contraction, there are really massive losses. I've seen different estimates, but pretty clearly more than $1 billion a year on average. Interestingly, the losses during COVID are about the same as before, but there's not really, I see a strategy necessarily in sight for how this will be profitable. And so it's one thing if Etihad is a loss leader, but it's another if there's a dependence on prestige for the investment to work. There's obviously sponsoring Man City gives tremendous brand visibility, but there's a question of whether that will actually turn into profits. Masdar City, right, is supposed to be this zero carbon example. Most of the goals have been scrapped. It's an interesting place, but it was trying to be an innovation ecosystem, and it really didn't meet a lot of the goals that it had set out. And there's the idea that the state can fund its way to a knowledge economy. Some people talk about the Singapore model. And of course, in a couple of minutes, we'll talk about some of the limits of this focus in the Gulf, given its political environment in particular. In real estate and tourism were already challenged before COVID, as we can see, fewer arrivals, real estate prices are down, etc. Right, so COVID's impact, this is a beach on Dubai. Normally, during this time of year, there's lots and lots and lots of people on the beaches in Dubai, at least through March. It's obviously not the case now. This is data from the Lebanese bank Audi, looking at 2020. I mean, and it's captured the first sort of 3 months before COVID. Hotel occupancy rates are down. Real GDP growth down. Most of these key sectors, perhaps with the exception of some of the logistics pieces, are really taking a beating, as has oil, until some recent minor rebounds. So in this context, the UAE has launched some really ambitious reforms. 100% foreign ownership of property, citizenship for talented expatriates, not just investors, but also, quote, creative talents, as well as people like doctors, nurses, etc. And so the idea is this will encourage more FDI, particularly FDI from outside the Middle East, and attract the people necessary to make a knowledge economy work. Reform of the penal code. So, for example, in the UAE, you could be arrested for cohabitation, living with someone without marrying them. This is on the docket to be changed. More accommodating divorce laws, more accommodating regulation toward alcohol. The idea being that these reforms will, again, make the UAE a more attractive destination, not just for tourism, but also for the knowledge economy. Emphasis on cultural tourism, particularly links to Israel and to the Jewish diaspora, a synagogue, mosque, church, the Abrahamic family house complex, just maybe one example. And there's been a big push to recruit tourists from Israel. And then, of course, everyone has seen this historic picture, and the UAE is trying to push for this as part of a image for a place you want to be in the knowledge economy. There are obviously risks and challenges, right? On one, you have in English a prominent Emirati asking some pointed questions about what this means for children of Emirati mothers with foreign fathers who face some obstacles toward gaining Emirati citizenship, asking about whether Emirati will be illegally allowed to have other citizenship. It's just one representation of some pushback. We also have King Faisal, and the normalization is betrayal that was trending on Twitter, and perhaps some backlash among both nationals, but also other citizens in the region.
So now we're going to explore a little bit about how we can foster innovation in the GCC as a means of economic diversification. And Gulf states will need to make fundamental changes in order to foster this homegrown innovation. And here are a few ways that GCC governments can catalyze innovation and move their economies towards a more diversified economy. So the first is that governments must invest in startup activity. Startups are just 0.3% of all companies in the MENA region. And if you compare that to the OECD average of 6.9%, there's obviously a big gap there. And we're seeing a lot of venture capital funding from the region go into these large funds like the SoftBank Vision Fund. But they're mostly focused on startups outside of the region, and there's a focus on Silicon Valley. So GCC's governments need to start funding and supporting regional startups. And this includes improving business conditions and making it easier to start companies in the Gulf, funding regional and local startups, as well as encouraging more foreign direct investment. The second point is around changing the norm. So although there have been some shifts, the regional norm for career success remains a stable job in a large company or government office. And GCC countries should work to shift these social attitudes in order to foster entrepreneurship. The MENA region has the lowest rate of established entrepreneurs compared to other regions at 6.8%. So changing the social norms around starting the ecosystems will be a difficult but effective way to boost the startup ecosystem. The third point is around leveraging existing technological talent. So applying existing advanced technologies that are native to the region to tangential industries can help Gulf states become a leader in technologies such as thermal or renewable energy, where they could leverage existing oil technology. We've seen Israel create this really strong startup and technology ecosystem that was rooted out of their military technological capabilities. They were able to transfer the knowledge to their startup and technology ecosystem, and it worked really well for them. And then the last is partnerships in academia. So since universities typically have strong research capabilities, GCC governments can form partnerships, host pitch events, and use recruitment from universities to foster this innovation. And Lastly, academic openness must be enforced and encouraged to ensure that GCC academia isn't leaving the country, that the country isn't experiencing brain drain and can hold their top talents in research. And we understand that there's a push and pull, and there's a lot to shift from social to legal to economic factors. And we recognize that there needs to be a balance between innovation and moving forward, as well as holding on to what it means to be a part of each of these Gulf states. And in essence, what I'm trying to say is that it'll be important to foster this growth and innovation in a localized context. I think you're muted, Professor.
Sam, you're muted. Sam, I still can't hear you.
This is really okay.
You're good now.
There we go. Okay. How many times does it take for the professor to unmute himself? 3, apparently. So the last piece on the academic side is also the vast majority of institutions are teaching focused with the sort of teaching loads and requirements that make it very, very difficult to do research. And I understand the imperatives, but that's also another, I think, challenge. So really where we're going with this research, and we're obviously interested in hearing from the audience, is really looking to see what is the likely outcome of some of these reforms, which I think are promising, but there's the question of will they actually go far enough to let the UAE accomplish what it's trying to, particularly in the innovation area, and how does that fit into the rest of the context? And I think within the next few months, this is going to become a working paper that can be shared rather than a academics not so great first draft. So with that, we'll welcome questions and also welcome follow-up via email afterward. But without any further ado, I will turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Toronto.
Hey, thanks, Sam, and thanks, Sobhon. Screen. That's not what we want. All right. Can we see the screen? Sam, can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Sweet.
Good.
Actually, it's the last slide. That's the name of my book. So we're going to start at the first slide. So like Sam mentioned, I'm commissioning editor at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center Program on Civil Military Relations in Arab States. I know that's a mouthful, but I'll tell you what we do. We're trying to create a dialogue in both English and Arabic about how military authorities and civilian authorities interact in Arab states and in the Middle East region widely. And I came to this because of my interest in Middle East security, because I'm a civil military relations scholar. But also, if you want to know how a country approaches innovation, how a country approaches development, look at how it treats the military. And look at the dynamic relationship between military and civilian authority. That will tell you a tremendous deal about the political culture, about the goals and objectives, and about the underlying environment for things like development, political development in particular, and growth. And more specifically, in the book that I wrote, which, as Sam mentioned, it'll strain the budget. It's $93. So I don't suggest you buy it, but if you have a library that can then stomach the cost, you're welcome to try. But I'll go through some of the arguments in that book now, because I think it's an important window on the larger process of modernization in the Arab Gulf region. So I'm going to start with a broad international context and talk about how militaries learn, how militaries become professional, how this dynamic in civil military relations has changed historically in other countries, and then focus in on the UAE, because as Sam mentioned, he and I were both faculty members at the UAE National Defense College. I was one of the founding faculty members. Sam was too. I was there for 6 years until 2019. And so I saw the first 6 years of how the college developed. And so I'll provide some of my, the things I saw, and maybe even an observation or two of what we could learn. And then finally, what that means for security in the region, based on what I saw. Okay, so some overall context. I'm gonna have to move my. Oh, it doesn't move. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so the UAE is often seen as a bright spot in security assistance and in military modernization, in the reforming of militaries. And it goes without saying that they have acquired a great deal of tactical capability over the past 30 years. And it's been quite impressive. But there are still reasons to worry about where that might lead. Because I'm not convinced that the UAE has adopted a system of thinking in military innovation and a system of thinking in terms of how to apply lessons and how to learn about succeeding on the battlefield. That, and based on this lack of learning, it indicates that we have reason to worry about the security situation in the Gulf and in the larger region. That unless that system of thinking changes, and there's more openness to be accountable for mistakes, to be able to challenge authority without consequences, the sorts of things that underpin innovation more broadly, I think we're going to see more chaos and violence in the Middle East in the years to come. So this chart is a series of regressions that I present in my book. And it's looking at the most basic level, some indicators of how militaries become more professional over time. And it's looking at what are the correlates of the development of this professionalism over time. And some of the interesting things I find is that economic development, and in particular the accumulation of capital, and especially the accumulation of human capital, are some of the main correlates of developing professionalism over time, developing this, what I call the system of military reflection. But also that regime type and great power status aren't consistently correlated with the development of military professionalism. And we can talk about this more in the Q&A if you like, but where that brings me is in 2013, when I went to the UAE to help establish the National Defense College. It was, I thought, a propitious time. It was an opportunity to solidify this system of thinking in the UAE military, a system of critical thinking, strategic planning that has been thoroughly adopted in most Western militaries, and I perceived an openness to adopt this kind of thinking in the UAE. This was just after the Arab Spring, but before the 2013 coup in Egypt, where Abdel Fattah al-Sisi came to power. So it was in this moment where there was hope of dramatic change in the future. So let me just show you. Okay. So this data is from 2010, and what we see is that there is a pretty clear correlation between, on the one hand, this having wealth, the GDP per capita, and having human capital, or the average number of years of college, tertiary education, and the probability of establishing a war college. And this is what I found in the long-term time series regressions that was a correlate of developing military professionalism in other countries around the world. And in 2010, we could see what the graph looked like. This is the scatter plot, the snapshot in 2010. And so I thought, yeah, well, the UAE cares about innovation. The UAE cares about developing its human capital. And so I was very hopeful that we'd be able to build something in the UAE that could truly change the way people approach security in military operations, military planning, strategic thinking in the Middle East, starting with the UAE. And so what I found was that we were able to make a substantial difference in the thinking of individuals. Our mission was to instill critical thinking skills and strategic planning capability in the small cohorts of students. The first year there were about 30 students, and then it increased in the successive years to around 40, 45. I think since it's gone down to about 30. So the number of students always hovered around 30 or 40. And so our job was to help them develop those individual thinking skills and critical thinking skills that they would need to plan strategically when they went back to the government or their home offices, whether it was Etihad or whether it was military staffs or the NSC, as the case may be. We had some pretty stark challenges because there were some unknowns. We didn't know what kind of students we'd get, or in particular how students would be selected, or where they would go after they graduated. So we didn't know what kind of impact we might have. We also we had to develop a whole system of college policies nearly from scratch. And in some cases, we were, building the plane in flight, as they say in the military. We were creating policies on the fly and then trying to institutionalize them after the fact without having a broad-based discussion about what the policy should be. And this was especially relevant for things like how are we going to evaluate the thesis project, their approach to grading, could we fail people, did everybody have to get an A? And so those sorts of discussions and challenges we had to decide on the fly. And there's also a challenge of faculty selection and retention, because it's not an easy thing to get somebody to come from a Western country to leave an academic environment there and come to the sort of environment that Sam and Sobhon just described, where there's a high teaching load and there's not necessarily the same openness to academic, critical academic thought or research that there is in other countries. And so retaining faculty ended up being a challenge. When faculty got other opportunities, they often took them. So based on these and facing these challenges, what we did we adopted a teaching style that is prevalent in USPME, which is a seminar-based discussion where students would read a set of readings. They would come to the college. They would have a lecture on that subject, and then we'd break out into small group discussions of between 10 and 12 people, participants, to discuss the readings that day. And that was a great venue, great environment for developing the individual critical thinking skills of individual students. The issue was that when they graduated, it wasn't clear that they were able to maintain that same system of thought in the workplace. We had pretty open discussions in the classroom, pretty frank, not only about Western policy or regional dynamics generally, but also about UAE government policy. What are the strategic dilemmas? What are the pros and cons? And so it was never clear to me that once they left, they could actually influence thinking in their home offices. And there were some indications that simply wasn't the case. I had some alumni tell me that they would go back and they look back very fondly on their time at NDC for the intellectual ferment that they felt there, but that they didn't necessarily have the impact that they were expecting, and they simply weren't listened to when it came to applying some of the things that we had taught them at the college. There were other students that were put in pretty prominent positions, not only in civilian government, but also on military staffs. Then in 2017, I reached a moment, the moment when they had the break with Qatar. At that point, Saudi Arabia and the UAE had already been engaged in Yemen for some time, and that the Yemen intervention was in 2015 is when I started thinking, well, maybe I'm not having the effect that I thought institutionally I would when I was at the college, or that the college would have the effect that we thought it would. Some of the decision making didn't demonstrate a sense of strategic planning and forethought that I had expected, that we had tried to teach the participants when they were at the college. The involvement in Yemen turned into something after 2017 into a very strategically ambiguous enterprise. Now, to be fair, the UAE's involvement in Yemen was no better or worse than the United States' involvement in Iraq for a much longer period of time. But I will say that the manner of the involvement and the manner of the exit and the lack of tactical movement on the ground and the lack of strategic movement at the bargaining table indicates that the college wasn't having the impact that we had hoped it would. And so as I step back and I think, okay, why was it that we were having this dramatic effect on individual critical thinking capabilities and this ability to be creative and to innovate in the classroom, but not translate that into a change in how decisions were made? There are a couple possibilities. It could be that developing the institutional response or the institutional effects of innovation take longer to manifest themselves. And I am perfectly willing to accept that, maybe I'm just impatient. The other possibility is that the system of how we approach new ideas, the approach to innovation, may require a systemic shock in order to change. So we thought maybe 2014, 2015, the shock of oil prices would sort of jolt decision makers into demonstrating more openness to challenging political authority, to changing the underlying social political paradigm of a country. That hasn't manifested itself. And I think that is one reason why we didn't see the institutional impact that we had hoped we would. At the same time, it also speaks volumes to the nature of civil-military relations, of how civilian and military authorities interact in the UAE specifically and in other Arab states more generally. In particular, the inability of a military officer on a planning staff to challenge the ideas in a room or to offer alternatives. This is the sort of openness to new ideas that is inherent in modern Western militaries today. Everybody understands on a military staff that there is a time for being creative, a time for understanding the situation holistically, and a time for offering your opinion at a moment when it can make the most impact. And there's also a time when the decision is made that you don't question that. However, the manner of operating in many militaries in Arab states is, in what I saw in the UAE, is that there's never that moment for questioning authority. There's never that moment for understanding the broad range of all potential alternatives that are on the table, some of which may feel uncomfortable from a social or cultural perspective. So it's that culture, or the lack of a culture of challenging authority and of innovation, that is lacking in how the military thinks. But that's also a reflection on the wider society, that's not simply not present, or it's not ingrained in the rest of society, or at the broad political level. This has a relationship to democracy and political development, but also has relationship to economic development and how we can expect that to occur. But it also tells us something about how decision-making in the security realm might develop. Because unless we have a situation in which there is an openness in how a military operates to operate in a more liberal fashion, to be not saying left-leaning, but in a Western liberal fashion mode of military professionalism, then it appears unlikely that we're going to move out of decision-making beyond a small group of people. And we may continue to see the sorts of decision-making, lack of respect for the law of war, the sorts of lack of strategic creativity that has hampered the coalition in Yemen, and potentially also has had negative side effects in Libya. So I guess the point being that I hope the greatest and the success for my friends in the UAE, but I'm not confident in the short term that innovation and that change in the system of thinking will actually occur, absent an exogenous shock. This is the title of the book. I don't suggest you buy it, but there it is. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me. Oh, I guess I didn't. That's my email address right there. And I look forward to the discussion in the Q&A. Sam, over to you.
So let's see. Has the professor successfully unmuted himself this time? All right, good. It is a good book. It's worth buying. If you have the the expense account that lets you buy.
Yeah, it's $93. Like, I don't expect anybody to buy it.
All right. Hey, it's always a question of who has the book budget. So we have several questions. And I'll start with the question from Mike. But actually, I first want to ask my colleagues, which questions can you see and which are the questions that only I can see? So I have questions in the chat and questions and a question and answer. Can you see all of them or only?
Yeah, we can see both.
Okay, great. So I'll start with Mike Thompson's question, which is, what is the connection between economic diversification, development of democratic culture? Is that a concern to GCC monarchies as they diversify? Is there a middle point between diversification and the monarchy's interest in maintaining power? So I'd say it's absolutely a concern. I've heard several people in the region talk about the Singapore model or the Chinese model of diversification and building an economic of economic diversification and knowledge sector investment, and the idea that we would like to decouple the two. And the question is, I guess, twofold. One is how accurate that is in describing those two models, and then how applicable that is to the GCC. So I think there's the idea that we can diversify without opening, or we can diversify with opening only in some ways, but certainly not politically. And so I think the question is how possible that is. Of course, we'll leave China to the side. I think we wouldn't call Singapore a democracy, but I think we would say there's more space in Singapore than the Gulf, maybe with the possible exception of Kuwait and its sort of unique parliament. So, yeah, I'm not. Is there a midpoint? I think maybe the question is more what risks are GCC countries willing to take for the goal of economic diversification? And I think in the short term, the answer is as few risks as possible. That may change.
I think, Sam, about the case of Egypt, where Hosni Mubarak tried to liberalize the economy without a political opening, and realized that that wasn't always possible. And so he started opening the aperture just a little bit in terms of political dissent. And then it was blindsided essentially by the Arab Spring. And I think rulers throughout the region saw that as a case study in what not to do, right? And that hence the sort of infatuation with the Singapore model, the China model, because it offers the promise of this bifurcated development where we can open economically but not politically. But I think ultimately there will always be an inflection point where you have to decide. There's a sort of a plateau. We haven't reached that point, obviously, in China and Singapore, or clearly not in the Gulf, right? I don't think we're seeing the sort of economic development in the Gulf that we're seeing in China and Singapore.
Yeah, no,
but there'll come a time, I think, when all these countries will have to choose: are we truly going to be an open economy, or are we just going to have constrained economic development?
And actually, that links to the next question by Roland on expat citizenship. Actually, he says, assuming for Arabs, but actually not. That's not really the target. The target is probably some Arabs, but more probably making the UAE attractive for non-Arabs. And in fact, the UAE has not been particularly keen on importing Arabs in any part of its expat mix. The idea is that this is more likely to get people who are going to be entangled in local politics, which we don't really want. So we would rather have expats from non-Arab countries. And this has created some backlash in terms of the proliferation of English and people who are further in sort of some of the cultural values, perhaps, than Emirati. But I think the question is, can we have a expat knowledge model where the expats aren't sort of politically invested. But I'm not sure how tenable it is to have these citizens who are not part of the polity.
I mean, there is a sense they don't want somebody to be completely divorced from the culture and society, right? They want these expat citizens essentially to learn Arabic, to understand the culture, to embrace that. Um, but yeah, it's hard for somebody that it's hard to learn Arabic. It's hard to become involved in that culture. Um, but so that again, that's another sort of dilemma.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, Sobhon, feel free to jump in on any of these if you want. On the healthcare sector, I think it's primarily service right now. There's a desire to do the research, but it's just not there and not really even close to being there right now. This is certainly a sector where I hear people talk about as a goal, but I think it's aspirational rather than being something meaningful.
It's kind of it's sucking up a lot of investment dollars for not as much value as they expected it would, and to build up this industry. I'll say that much. They're over budget and under value.
Which, to be fair, is common when you're trying to get into this sector.
True.
That's what I'll say. Nathan, do you want to take the sort of background of NDC students, et cetera?
Sure. Yeah, this is sort of two questions, right? Both fascinating questions. The socioeconomic background. Let me just say it like this: when your student comes in wearing a $150,000 watch, you get a sense for the socioeconomic dynamic. They'll have the Maserati, they have the all the fancy cars, so they're definitely from the upper crust of Emirati society. This wasn't like they had opened access to National Defense College for anybody who wanted to join. This was clearly those who were on an upward flight path in terms of being admitted to the higher echelons of government or military hierarchy, and so it's these were the wealthy, these were the elites. There were some exceptions, but generally speaking, these were elite Emiratis, and mostly young. About two-thirds of the students, at least two-thirds, were civilians. So from civilian sectors, like Etihad or Etihad Rail or Etisalat from the quasi-government sector, but also from different ministries like Ministry of Foreign Affairs, National Security Council, were some of the larger sources of these students. And they would generally go back to their home institutions once they finished up. In the military, the big challenge was finding people who spoke good enough English to attend the college, because instruction was in English and they had to produce a thesis in English, and that was sometimes a challenge. But generally speaking, the officers were also at a slightly higher rank, well, not higher rank, but slightly more senior than you'd find in a U.S. or NATO ally defense college. So where in a Western defense college, you'd find officers at the senior lieutenant colonel, junior colonel rank. You'd find at the UAE National Defense College that they would be senior colonels on the cusp of brigadier. Some of them, I think, a small handful were actually brigadier generals when they came to the college. But there's a proliferation of brigadier generals in the UAE military, so that may be to be expected. The second question, what accounts for this perceived level of professionalism in the UAE military? And I will give credit where credit is due. In terms of tactical capability, the UAE military is clearly head and shoulders above and beyond where other Arab militaries are. That, I mean, like I said, that goes without saying. I think you could read insightful recent reports by Ken Pollock and Melissa Dalton. Ken Pollock wrote for AI, and Melissa Dalton for Carnegie. You can read his Armies of Sand, Ken Pollock's Armies of Sand. But specifically on UAE military, Ken Pollock's recent report and Melissa Dalton's report on the UAE military. There are others too. I think Zoltan Barani is coming out with a book on the armies of Arabia that'll get into this. Essentially, in the 1990s, Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, made a choice that we are going to improve the military capabilities at our disposal. And so there's a deliberate policy of sending contingents of UAE forces, in particular from the Presidential Guard, to serve in all these international multinational forces, from Somalia and Bosnia to eventually in Afghanistan. And then finally in 2015, I think it was, I'm not sure the exact date, when the UAE conducted its first expeditionary operation without Western, I wouldn't say assistance, but Western partnership when they conducted sorties in Libya. Air sorties, and air-to-ground sorties in Libya. And so we see a consistent pattern of developing tactical capabilities. I think that's what explains the perception. But behind the scenes, how decisions are made, and I'm not talking about the political decisions. I'm talking about the military strategic decision making, right? The functions of a staff and how a staff operates, how plans are developed from the ground up. The system of thinking that produces that in Western militaries isn't present to the same extent in the UAE military, not by a long shot. And so while tactically they may be capable, the ability to apply that tactical capability to achieve strategic objectives in time and place may not be available, may not be present.
Yeah, Nathan, I just add one thing on the students. And this maybe links to your earlier question about why didn't the sort of changing the mindset work as well as we'd hoped. And that is how many students, notwithstanding the background, had said, I've never thought like this before. Whereas in any Western defense college, the defense college experience wouldn't be this so radically new in terms of how to think. And so I wonder if, in this sense, it needs to percolate more in the system. So it's not you get to be a colonel or you get to be a director, and now we're going to infuse large degrees of this very different way of thinking and doing business.
Part of the reason why Western militaries operate, and just real quick, did you see my email, Roland Maynardine? Confirm that you saw my email in the chat. Okay. I can't tell if you can see that or not. Oh, no, you probably didn't. Okay, hold on a second. Okay, now you probably saw it. Okay. So the question. Oh, my train of thought got derailed.
I mean, what I'm getting at is part of the problem that this is, you get to the senior level and your sort of thinking and way of doing business is being challenged rather than it building on something you've experienced at all the other blocks in your formation?
I think it has more to do with the political culture. The reason that Western militaries operate has a lot to do with political culture. The reason that many Western militaries operate the way they do is a function of liberal Western democracy. The space for discussion and dissent, the aperture is wider because that's just in the water, right? So it's easier to get to that system of thinking from a Western liberal democracy than it is from an autocratic system, say. That's not to say that it can't be accomplished, right? Because you can accomplish that. I mean, countries have demonstrated they can accomplish the connecting the tactical and the strategic in a military staff, even in a non-democracy. In the case of the Soviet Union is one case in point. It's possible that this exists in China. I'm not sure. I don't know enough about it. So I'm not saying they can't develop it without developing an open political system in the Gulf. All I'm saying is that it's probably going to be hard if you're trying this bifurcated development model, right? Saying, hey, we're going to open up economically but not politically. So what does that mean? So the way we plan military operations, the way that military authority and civilian authority is never going to change, ever. We can't challenge authority, ever. I mean, look, we had protests in the United States last summer, and military authorities said, we're not going to be involved, right? We had a very contentious election last fall, and military authorities came out and said, we're not going to get involved, right? Well, they did get involved in the demonstrations, but not the active forces, the National Guard, just thankfully. But that was a serious crisis in civil military relations, right? Last summer, in American civil military relations. I don't think that would happen in the Gulf. There wouldn't be a crisis because the military would just do what they were told.
I think last question. Did you see the question on whether this is related to Iran? This is in the question and answer box.
Nader Yani. Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting question, Nader. Maybe. What I do know, there are interesting facts about Iran, and just my perception, the way that Iranians think, there seems to be a lot more. I can't tell if they're following a bifurcated development model as well, or not, right? You have lots of very creative and open-minded people on both sides of the Arabian Gulf, okay, in both Iran and in the Gulf state, in the Arab Gulf states, right? But the real question is, what will the political system let people do? What is in the realm of the possible? I think Iranians have had to be creative and opportunistic out of necessity, right? But if you look at how the Iranians operated in the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, that didn't necessarily demonstrate a great deal of tactical innovation, right? So I think the evidence is mixed there. I'm just not sure. But in Iran, you have more people that don't go to religious services every week than you do in the United States, right? And when you see Iranian scientists or academics speak, when I've seen them speak, they say a lot of the right things, right? But at the same time, I know that there are constraints. So I just don't know. Depends. It's a classic answer.
All right. Well, I think we are about at time. So I would like to thank my fellow panelists. I'd like to thank the Middle East Dialogue for hosting us. And I'd like to thank all of the audience members for your participation on a long day of Zoominars.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Nathan, Sam, and Sobhon. This evening, I will be sending you an email to follow up with some information on links to videos for the other sessions, which we'll be posting next week, and some information about publishing opportunities that the Policy Studies Organization offers. So I'll be in touch. We've reached the end of our program, so thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.